The morning the city inspector showed up at Loretta Abara's shop, he had a clipboard in one hand and a smirk on his face that he didn't bother hiding. That was a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the lock had been changed. The sign above the door, the one Loretta had painted herself, deep burgundy letters on cream, was gone. And the week after that, something happened that nobody in that strip mall on Dundas Street West had ever seen coming. But let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand what Loretta Abara had built and what it cost her to build it. Loretta Abara had come to Toronto from Scarborough, not from somewhere else, not from far away. She'd grown up 3 bus transfers from that strip mall. In a house where her mother kept a box of receipts under the kitchen sink because she didn't trust banks, and her father repaired other people's shoes in the garage on weekends. Because the plant checks weren't always reliable, Loretta had watched both of them work without complaint. She'd learned from that. Maybe too well. She'd spent 11 years in corporate catering before she opened Abara's. 11 years of showing up early, staying late, training people half her age who got promoted over her while she kept training their replacements. She didn't dwell on that. There was no use. What she did instead was save. Every birthday check, every overtime hour, every year-end bonus, all 4 of them across 11 years. She kept a spreadsheet. She kept 2 copies. When she finally signed the lease on the unit at 1140 Dundas West, she was 44 years old, and she had enough to cover the first 18 months of rent with a buffer left over for equipment. The space had been a dry cleaner's before. It smelled like solvent for 3 weeks after she moved in. She mopped the floor herself. She repainted the walls herself. She called her cousin Tabena to help her hang on the shelving, and they ate jollof rice out of a pot on the floor the night before the soft opening because there were no chairs yet. Abara's was a catering supply shop. Specialty linens, tableware, serving equipment for rent or purchase. She knew the industry. She knew what small restaurants needed and couldn't always afford to keep on hand. She filled a gap that had existed in that neighborhood for years. Within 8 months, she had a wait list, 4 rental bookings on weekends. The unit next to hers was vacant. Had been for almost 2 years. The property manager, a man named Howard Peel, worked out of an office in Etobicoke and visited the strip mall roughly twice a year, usually to collect something or complain about something. He was the kind of man who made you feel vaguely inspected whenever he spoke to you. Not threatening, just watchful in a way that felt like assessment. Loretta had spoken to Peel 3 times since signing her lease. The first time he'd asked if she'd considered a different kind of signage because the burgundy letters were a lot. She'd smiled and said she'd think about it. She hadn't thought about it. The second time he'd mentioned that a franchise was interested in the vacant unit and that the landlord preferred a certain consistency along the strip. She wasn't sure what that meant and didn't ask. The third conversation was shorter. He told her her lease renewal paperwork would be coming soon. That was 7 months ago. She'd followed up twice by email. Both times she received an auto reply saying Howard Peel was out of office. Both times, nothing came after. Now, if you've ever run a small business, and a lot of you watching know exactly what this feels like, you know that a landlord who goes quiet on a lease renewal is not a good sign. It is, in fact, one of the worst signs. Because it means someone is waiting for your lease to lapse, waiting for an opportunity to open up that they can take advantage of without a conversation. Loretta knew this. She'd worked in catering long enough to watch 3 restaurant owners lose their spaces the same way. So, she did what any careful, experienced business person does. She called a lawyer. The lawyer, a woman named Priya Mehta, who practiced commercial tenancy law out of a converted Victorian on Bloor, told Loretta something she already half suspected. Her lease had a renewal clause, but it required written notice 60 days before the end of term. The end of Loretta's term was 11 weeks away. She had not received renewal paperwork. She was still technically within her window, but barely. Priya Mehta sent a formal notice of intent to renew. Certified mail, email with read receipt. Fax, because Howard Peel's office still listed a fax number, which told Loretta a great deal about Howard Peel. The response came 9 days later. Not from Peel, from someone named R. Dunstable, identified in the letter footer as Associate Director of Leasing, Cairn Property Group. Loretta had never heard of Cairn Property Group. She looked them up that evening at the counter after closing. The shop quiet around her, the smell of fresh linen and cedar from the display cabinet drifting through the air. Cairn Property Group had acquired a portfolio of 31 commercial properties across the GTA 8 months ago. One of those properties was 1140 Dundas West. Howard Peel, it turned out, wasn't her landlord anymore. Hadn't been for 8 months. Nobody had told her. The letter from R. Dunstable was 4 paragraphs. Loretta read it twice. Then she took a photograph of it with her phone and texted it to Priya Mehta without comment. What the letter said, in the careful, laundered language of someone who has had things reviewed by their own lawyers, was this. Cairn Property Group had plans for the unit currently occupied by Abara's catering supply. They were exploring repositioning options for the strip mall. Her renewal request had been received. However, given the upcoming changes to the property's tenant composition, they were not in a position to offer renewal terms at this time. They wished her well in her future endeavors. She had 8 weeks to vacate. 8 weeks. Loretta sat with that letter for a long moment. The shop was empty. The streetcar hummed past outside. Someone had taped a hand-lettered open sign on the bakery across the street, and the light behind it was warm orange in the November dusk. She thought about the spreadsheet. She thought about the 11 years. She thought about the first 18 months of rent, which she had paid on time, every time, never once short. She thought about the wait list for weekend rentals, the restaurants that counted on her, the woman who came in every third Tuesday to look at new tablecloth patterns and always ended up buying something she hadn't planned to. Then she picked up her phone and called Priya Mehta. What Loretta Abara did not do in those first hours was panic. She did not post anything. She did not call anyone to vent. She did not cry, not that night. What she did was ask precise questions and write down precise answers, and then she went home and slept 6 hours because she had learned a long time ago that decisions made on no sleep were decisions that the twice. Priya Mehta's assessment was blunt. The lease renewal clause was valid and enforceable, possibly a deliberate one, in failing to notify Loretta of the ownership change. In Ontario, commercial tenants have specific protections under certain conditions when ownership transfers without proper notice. The repositioning plan's language in the letter was vague enough to be legally suspicious. There was a case here. It wasn't guaranteed, but it existed. There was something else, too. Priya had noticed something in the property records while pulling the file. The strip mall at 1140 Dundas West had received 2 complaints in the past 18 months from the city's bylaw enforcement office, one about exterior signage, one about accessibility compliance on a rear entrance. Both complaints had been filed. Neither had resulted in a formal order, but both were in the record. Neither complaint had been filed against Abara's. But Loretta was the only tenant whose lease was not being renewed. When Priya said that out loud, Loretta didn't respond right away. She was standing in her shop, mid-morning, a delivery of pressed napkins stacked on the counter beside her. She looked at the burgundy letters in the window. "So what do we do?" she said finally. It wasn't really a question. "We respond formally," Priya said. "We document everything. And we don't leave." The formal response went to Cairn Property Group's legal counsel the following Tuesday. It cited the renewal clause, the notice of intent already filed within the required window, the failure to notify of ownership transfer, and, carefully, precisely, with of accusation, the pattern of complaints and the selective non-renewal. It requested a meeting within 10 business days. Cairn did not respond within 10 business days. What they did instead was send a city bylaw inspector to Loretta's unit on a Thursday morning. His name was listed on the inspection form as G. Tremont, Bylaw Enforcement Officer, City of Toronto. He arrived at 9:15 before most of her regular customers. He had a clipboard. He had the smirk. He walked slowly through the shop, making notes. He measured the rear exit clearance. He photographed the storage area. He asked Loretta, with a tone that managed to be both pleasant and condescending at once, whether she was aware that certain shelving configurations could constitute a fire code concern. Loretta said she was happy to address any actual violations. She asked to see his identification. She photographed it with her phone. She wrote down the badge number. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She watched him finish his walkthrough and leave. And then she called Priya Mehta and told her what had happened before she even turned the sign back to open. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone in a position of authority come into your space and make you feel like you don't belong there, you know that feeling. You know the very specific way it settles in your chest. Not fear, not quite. Something heavier than fear. The feeling of having to perform calm while everything inside you is cataloging the injustice. Loretta knew that feeling well. She had felt it in boardrooms and at loading docks and in lease offices, and on the phone with city administrators who called her Han without being asked. She had learned, over 44 years, to keep that feeling filed away somewhere useful rather than anyone's destructive. She filed it. She stayed. The inspection report came back with 3 items flagged. One was a rear exit clearance issue that required a minor adjustment to a shelving unit, a 20-minute fix. One was a labeling requirement on a storage container that Loretta resolved the same afternoon. The third item was described as a structural concern related to the load-bearing assessment of a mezzanine storage platform she had installed 18 months ago. The report noted that this item required a licensed structural engineer's assessment before the space could continue operating. A structural engineer's assessment in Toronto, with any reasonable turnaround time, cost between $1,800 and $3,000, and it could take 3 to 6 weeks to schedule, which meant, conveniently, that Loretta's operation could be suspended pending the assessment, and her remaining window to vacate was 7 weeks. She had seen this before, not done to her, but done. She had watched it happen to her uncle's restaurant years ago. A different landlord, a different part of the city, the same geometry of pressure. You find a technical lever, you apply it with official paperwork. You make someone feel like the problem is their fault, their failure, their inadequacy. And then they leave. The difference was that Loretta had Priya Mehta. And Priya Mehta had been paying attention. The mezzanine platform had been installed with permits. All permits had been filed with the city. The structural assessment had been completed at the time of installation by a licensed engineer, a man named David Osi Kwame, who had also, as it happened, assessed 3 other commercial units in that strip mall in the past 4 years. His report was on file with the city, in the same database the bylaw inspector would have accessed before issuing his flagged item. In other words, the structural concern had already been assessed. The flag was either an error or it was not an error. Prahlad, Priya's letter to the bylaw office, copied to the city's integrity office, and to the property owner of record, asked that question in writing. Politely, precisely. With 7 attachments, including the original permit, the engineer's report, the timestamp of the city's own record, and the badge number Loretta had written down on a Thursday morning. 3 days later, the structural flag was rescinded, and then something shifted. Loretta had been quiet through all of this. She had not spoken publicly. She had not gone to the media. She had not posted. But she had been talking to people she trusted. Her accountant, a woman named Sandra Achebe, who had been doing the books for small black-owned businesses in Toronto's West End for 22 years. A man named Fitzroy Llewellyn, who ran the barbershop 2 doors down and had been watching the whole situation with careful eyes. And her cousin Tabena, who had helped hang the shelving, and who now worked in commercial real estate on the other side of the city. Tabena had been doing his own research. He was not a lawyer. He was not in the press, but he understood property records, and he had spent 3 weeks pulling everything that he could find on Cairn Property Group. What he found was not illegal. It was not secret. It was, in the language of public records, simply true. Cairn Property Group's principal investor, the name on the original acquisition filing, was a numbered company. That numbered company's registered agent was a law firm. That law firm had in its client list on its own website a development consortium whose portfolio included a proposed mixed-use residential project at the corner of Dundas and Brock, 1 block west of Loretta's shop. The strip mall at 1140 Dundas West sat on a lot that backed up against a laneway that connected to that corner. If the strip mall were to be repositioned, if its existing leases were allowed to lapse, the lot became significantly more interesting to a developer assembling land for a mid-rise project. Tabena sent Loretta a PDF with the relevant pages highlighted. She read it at her counter on a Sunday evening. The shop was closed. The heater clicked on and off in the quiet. She sent it to Priya without a word. Again. Priya called within the hour. What happened in the next 10 days was not dramatic. It was procedural. It was methodical. It was the kind of justice that looks, from the outside, like paperwork. But that is, in fact, the result of someone refusing to be moved, when every force around them was designed to make moving feel inevitable. Priya Mehta filed a human rights complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, citing the pattern of conduct, the selective non-renewal, the complaint history, the bylaw inspection sequence, as evidence of discriminatory treatment in the context of a commercial tenancy. She filed it the same morning she sent a letter to Cairn Property Group's legal counsel, notifying them of the filing. She also sent a copy to a journalist named Laura Tenchert at the Toronto Star, who had written 3 pieces in the past 2 years about displacement of black-owned businesses in the West End. Priya did not make claims. She shared facts. She let the facts be facts. Laura Tenchert made 3 phone calls. Then she drove to Dundas Street West and stood outside Abara's for about 20 minutes, looking at the burgundy letters. The piece ran 8 days later. It was not a long piece. It did not name Cairn in dramatic terms. It was the kind of piece that asks questions, specific, documented questions, and lets readers draw conclusions that the record supports. It mentioned the permits. It mentioned the engineer's report. It mentioned the timeline. It mentioned that 3 other tenants in the strip mall had received lease renewals in the past 6 months. It mentioned that Loretta was the only black business owner in the strip. Cairn Property Group's communications team issued a statement. The statement said that all tenancy decisions were made on a commercial basis without regard to any protected characteristics, and that they took such concerns seriously, and that they were committed to transparent and fair practices. The statement used the word committed twice and the word values once. Priya Mehta read the statement and said nothing publicly. 2 days after the piece ran, Loretta received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Renata Solberg, Senior Vice President of Tenant Relations at Cairn Property Group. Renata Solberg had a very measured voice. She said that Cairn had completed an internal review of the situation and had identified some procedural gaps in the transition of the portfolio from the previous owner. She said that they wanted to address the matter directly. She asked if Loretta would be available for a meeting that week. Loretta said she would have her lawyer present. Renata Solberg said that was completely understandable. The meeting was held at Priya Mehta's office on Bloor, which was deliberately not Cairn's boardroom, a choice that Priya had suggested and Loretta had immediately agreed to. There were 4 people in the room: Loretta, Priya, Renata Solberg, and a man from Cairn's legal team whose name Loretta did not write down because she had decided she didn't need it. Renata Solberg offered a 5-year lease renewal at the current rate with a fixed annual increase of 2%. She offered to cover the cost of any outstanding compliance concerns identified in the bylaw review. Which was to say, there were none, but the offer was made as a gesture. She offered in writing a formal acknowledgement that Cairn had failed to notify Loretta of the ownership transfer in accordance with standard practice. She did not offer an apology. Loretta noticed that. She noted it the same way she noted other things. Quietly, precisely, filed away. Priya negotiated the fixed rate for 7 years instead of 5. She negotiated a right of first refusal if the property were ever sold. She negotiated a clause requiring 45 days written notice before any bylaw-related inspections could be initiated at Cairn's request. Not city-initiated, but Cairn requested. That clause took 40 minutes to agree on. Loretta sat through all 40 of those minutes without speaking. When the document was finalized and signed, Renata Solberg shook Loretta's hand and said she looked forward to a productive relationship. Loretta shook her hand and said she was sure it would be. Outside on Bloor, the November air had the cold clarity that only comes in that particular Toronto way, dry and bright and sharp at the edges. Loretta stood on the sidewalk while Priya finished a call inside. Tabena had texted, "How'd it go?" Sandra Achibi had texted, "Call me." Fitzroy Llewellyn, 2 doors down from the shop, had texted a single thumbs up, which meant he already knew somehow. She texted Tabena back first, 7 years. He sent back 3 exclamation marks and a handshake emoji, which from Tabena was essentially a standing ovation. Now some people watching this might say, it worked out, but it shouldn't have had to happen. And they're right. Priya Mehta said the same thing in different words when Loretta thanked her afterward. "You did everything right from the beginning," Priya said. "The permits, the records, the notice. You did everything right. The problem is that doing everything right is only sometimes enough." She paused. It was enough this time. Loretta went back to the shop. She unlocked the door. She turned on the lights. She put the kettle on in the back room. The shelves of pressed linens, the stacked serving platters, the rental inventory log open on the laptop. All of it exactly where she had left it. All of it still hers. The sign above the door was still burgundy letters on cream. It had never actually come down. It had felt, at certain moments in the past 11 weeks, like it might. But it hadn't. Fitzroy knocked on the glass an hour later, held up a takeout container from the Jamaican place around the corner, and raised his eyebrows in a question. Loretta waved him in. They ate at the counter. The streetcar went past. A customer came in for a tablecloth pickup and stayed to chat for 10 minutes about an event she was planning for February. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it always did in November. Low and gold, and gone too quickly. Before you go, if this story stayed with you, if you've watched someone hold the line when everything was pushing them toward the door, or if you've held that line yourself, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this community grow. And if you're new here, subscribe to Heirloom Tales. Every story we tell is about people who kept what was theirs. There are more of them than you'd think. The sign stayed up, and Loretta Abara stayed open.